My brother smugly bragged that Dad left the company to him. Little did he know what was coming. Hi, my name is Savannah Reese, and I'm 31 years old. And I need to tell you something before I tell you anything else. The night my father was rushed to the hospital, I was 3 states away closing a deal that would change everything. My phone buzzed at 11:47 p.m. I saw my brother's name on the screen, and I answered before the second ring, heart already in my throat, because Marcus never called that late unless something was wrong. He didn't say, "Are you okay?" He didn't say, "Dad's stable, don't panic." He didn't even say hello. What Marcus said was, "You should probably know that Dad updated his will last month. Reese Capital is coming to me. I've already spoken to the attorney." I stood there in a hotel hallway in Atlanta, still in my work clothes, holding my phone so tightly my knuckles went white, and I listened to my brother deliver that news with the careful, measured tone of someone who had been rehearsing it. Someone who had been waiting to say it. Someone who was enjoying this. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't say a single word he expected me to say. I said, very quietly, "Thank you for letting me know, Marcus. I'll be there by morning." And then I hung up and stood alone in that hallway, and for exactly 30 seconds I let the full weight of everything, 6 years of work, 6 years of silence, 6 years of being overlooked in my own family's company, press down on me all at once. 30 seconds. Then I straightened up, walked back to my room, and started making plans. Because Marcus had made a mistake. A catastrophic, irreversible, beautifully catastrophic mistake. And he had absolutely no idea. This is the story of how my brother's arrogance became the best gift he ever gave me, and how my family finally had to face every truth they had spent years carefully looking away from. My father, Robert Reese, was a builder. Not of buildings, of systems, of trust, of the kind of slow, compounding financial relationships that take decades to cultivate and minutes to destroy. He started Reese Capital Ventures in Charlotte when I was 4 years old and Marcus was 10, and by the time I was old enough to understand what the company actually did, it had already become the kind of firm that other firms in our region watched carefully. Dad was methodical in everything. The way he dressed, the way he spoke, the way he made decisions. Nothing was careless. Nothing was accidental. He had a yellow legal pad on his desk that he called his thinking pad, and before any major decision, he would fill at least 2 pages with handwritten notes. I used to watch him do it as a child and think, that's what serious looks like. My mother, Carol, was the emotional center of our family. Warm, funny, sharp in ways she deliberately underplayed because she understood that Dad needed to be the most serious person in any room, and she loved him enough to let him have that. She and I were close in a way that felt like 2 people who had found each other accidentally and were quietly grateful every day. She passed away from cancer when I was 22 and Marcus was 28, and I think that loss rearranged something fundamental in our family that we never properly repaired. After Mom died, Dad turned more fully toward the company. Not coldly, he still showed up, still called, still came to every important moment. But there was a new layer of distance in him, like a window that had fogged slightly and never quite cleared again. And in that distance, old assumptions hardened into facts. Marcus was the son. Marcus would take over. Marcus was the future of Reese Capital. Nobody said it directly. They never needed to. Marcus was 6 years older than me and had been working at the company in various capacities since his mid-20s. His role was VP of Client Relations, and he was genuinely good at the social architecture of that job: client dinners, relationship maintenance, the kind of quarterly check-in calls where you make someone feel valued without saying much of substance. He had Dad's easy confidence and none of his patience for detail, which created a combination that looked impressive from a distance and fell apart under close examination. I joined Reese Capital at 24, 1 year after completing my MBA. Dad offered me a junior analyst position, which was right. I hadn't earned anything more, and I wasn't looking for shortcuts. I came in early and stayed late and asked questions that made some of the senior staff visibly uncomfortable because they weren't used to someone caring that much about the answers. Within 2 years, I had moved into operations management. Within 4 years, I was running the operational infrastructure of a $200 million advisory firm and making decisions that affected every single employee, every single client, every single day. And almost nobody in my family talked about it. When Marcus brought in a new client, Dad mentioned it at dinner. When I rebuilt the entire client onboarding system and reduced processing errors by 40%, Dad nodded and said, "Good work, sweetheart." Same tone he used when I cleared the dinner table. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself the work was the point. I was wrong on both counts, but I wasn't ready to know that yet. The incidents accumulated slowly, the way water damage does, invisible until suddenly the ceiling is soft and you realize it's been happening for years. The first one that truly registered was at a company dinner 3 years into my time at Reese Capital. It was a client appreciation event at a restaurant downtown, 40 people, the kind of evening Dad used for relationship maintenance with the firm's top accounts. I had planned the entire event, venue selection, seating arrangements, menu, the personalized notes at each place setting that Dad's assistant told me later the clients kept talking about. Marcus arrived 40 minutes late, ordered the most expensive thing on the menu, told 3 stories that made the table laugh, and accepted 2 compliments about the evening's organization with a gracious smile and not a single correction. I watched from the other end of the table and felt something cold settle in my chest. Afterward, in the parking lot, I mentioned it to Dad, gently, carefully, framed as an observation rather than a complaint. Dad looked at me with genuine surprise, like the thought hadn't occurred to him, and said, "Marcus didn't mean anything by it, Savannah. You know how he is. He's just comfortable with people." Just comfortable with people. As if the problem was my discomfort, rather than his dishonesty. I drove home and did not sleep well. The second incident was more serious. 18 months later, we lost a significant client, a long-standing account worth nearly $500,000 annually, following a series of dropped communications that traced back directly to a gap in Marcus's team's follow-through process. A gap I had flagged in writing 4 months earlier, in a memo to both Dad and Marcus, with a specific recommended fix that would have taken 1 afternoon to implement. The memo had been acknowledged and filed and ignored. When the client formally withdrew, Dad called an internal review meeting. Marcus arrived with a prepared explanation that attributed the failure to industry-wide communication challenges and a junior associate named Chloe, who had been with us for 10 months and had done absolutely nothing wrong. I had the email timestamps. I had my original memo. I sat in that meeting with both documents open on my laptop and said nothing while Marcus reshaped the narrative in real time. After the meeting, I went to Dad's office alone and placed my original memo on his desk without a word. He read it. He already knew what it said. I could see that in his face. Then he looked up at me and said, "I'll speak to Marcus." "Did you speak to him the first time?" I asked. "After I sent this?" The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. That was the moment I started keeping records. Not because I was planning anything, I wasn't, not yet, but because something in me understood, finally and without room for argument, that in this family, I would always need to be able to prove what I had done. Nobody was going to do it for me. The third incident happened on a Tuesday morning, 8 months before Dad collapsed, and it was the one that changed the temperature of everything. Dad called us both into his office for what he described as a strategic planning session. Marcus sauntered in 12 minutes late with a coffee cup and no notepad. I came with a 40-page analysis I had been building for 3 weeks, a comprehensive review of the firm's current positioning, competitive landscape, 3 growth scenarios with financial projections, and a recommended 5-year strategy. I had worked on it every evening for 21 days. Dad looked at it carefully. He asked good questions. He was engaged and sharp in the way he always was when something genuinely interested him. And at the end of the meeting, after Marcus had contributed approximately 4 opinions and a suggestion that we consider expanding into new markets without any specifics whatsoever, Dad closed the document and said, "This is excellent work, Savannah. Marcus, I want you to review this before our next session. There are things here about client retention that connect directly to your division." Marcus picked up my 40-page document, glanced at the cover page, and said, "Sure, absolutely," in the tone of someone agreeing to something they will never do. He never mentioned it again. I know because I checked, quietly weeks later, and his copy was still in the same position on his desk, visibly unread. That evening I sat in my car in the parking garage for a long time before driving home. And I thought very clearly for the first time, how long am I going to do this? I didn't have an answer yet, but the question had been asked, and it didn't go back to sleep. The breaking point came 4 months later, on a Friday evening, at Dad's house. Dad had invited us both for dinner, unusual because he rarely did that on weekdays anymore. I assumed it was something personal, maybe health-related, because he had seemed tired at the office lately in a way that worried me. I brought food from his favorite Italian place on Providence Road and got there 30 minutes early to set the table, the way Mom used to. Marcus arrived 20 minutes late, kissed Dad on the cheek, complimented the food as if he'd contributed to it, and settled into the chair at the head of the table, Dad's chair, with the easy confidence of someone who has never once questioned where he belongs. We ate. We talked about the firm, about a new client Marcus was pursuing, about a regulatory update I had been managing. Normal. Surface level. Fine. Then Dad said, setting down his fork with a deliberateness that meant he was shifting into a different kind of conversation, I want to talk about the future of the company. Marcus straightened. I watched his posture change, subtle, almost imperceptible, but I knew my brother. Dad talked for several minutes about where he saw the firm in 10 years, about the importance of stable leadership, about legacy. And then he said something that hit me like cold water. Marcus, I want you to start preparing more seriously for a leadership transition. I'd like you to shadow Savannah more closely over the next year, really understand the operational side. She's built something important there. Shadow me. I looked at my plate. I kept my face completely neutral. Shadow me. After 6 years of carrying the operational backbone of this company, after 40-page strategy documents and rebuilt systems and late nights and lost clients and a memo that sat unread on a desk, the proposal was that my brother should shadow me. Marcus, to his credit, looked briefly uncertain. Then he recovered and said, "Of course, Dad. Absolutely. I think that makes a lot of sense." He looked at me with an expression I had never seen from him before, something almost competitive, recalibrating, like he was seeing me differently, like he had just realized for the first time that I might actually be in his way. That look told me everything. I drove home that night, and I sat at my kitchen table for 2 hours with a blank notepad in front of me. And I wrote one sentence at the top of the page. What do I actually want? And below it, slowly, I started writing the honest answer for the first time. What followed over the next 3 months, I did not tell anyone. Not a colleague, not a friend, not my father. I requested a private meeting with our corporate attorney, Dennis Hale, who had handled the firm's legal affairs for 12 years and who had always been scrupulously fair in his dealings with me. I asked him, in that meeting, to walk me through the formal requirements for a CEO succession appointment at a firm structured like ours. What the board would need to see. What the legal documentation would require. What the timeline would look like. Dennis listened carefully. Then he said, "Savannah, I'm going to ask you something directly. Are you having this conversation because you're thinking of leaving or because you're thinking of staying?" I looked at him across his desk and said, "I'm thinking of leading." He nodded slowly. Then he said, "Then you should know that based on everything I've observed over the past 6 years, you already are." That meeting lasted 2.5 hours. I left with a legal framework, a board presentation strategy, and a clarity I hadn't felt in years. Over the following 6 weeks, I prepared the most important document of my professional life. Not a memo, not an analysis, not a strategy report that would sit unread on someone's desk. A formal CEO succession proposal, comprehensive, legally sound, board-ready, built on 6 years of documented contributions, financial performance data, operational achievements, and a 5-year strategic vision for Reese Capital's future. I presented it to the board privately, member by member, before any formal meeting. I knew that a room full of people hearing something new all at once creates resistance. One person at a time, with full information and space for questions, that creates understanding. By the time the formal board meeting was called, 3 weeks before Dad collapsed, the outcome had already been shaped by 7 individual conversations, 7 sets of questions answered, 7 people who had looked at 6 years of evidence and reached the same conclusion. The vote was unanimous. 7-0. Dad signed the succession documents the following week. He cried, briefly, in a way I had almost never seen from him. Just a moment, quickly contained, his hand on my shoulder. He said, "I should have done this sooner." I said, "You did it at the right time." And 3 weeks later, on a rainy Thursday night, Marcus called me in an Atlanta hotel hallway to tell me the company was his. I walked into that hospital the next morning at 6:45 a.m. Marcus was in the waiting area with coffee and the particular expression of a man who believes he is about to inherit something. He stood when he saw me, opened his mouth, probably to continue what he'd started on the phone, and I held up one hand. "Dad first," I said. "Everything else can wait." Dad was stable, resting, his color better than I'd feared. I sat with him for an hour while he slept, holding his hand, and when he woke he looked at me and said, with the ghost of his old directness, "Don't let Marcus derail things, Savannah." "He won't," I said. 2 days later, Dad was moved to a recovery room, and the doctors confirmed he would need a minimum of 3 months away from work, possibly longer. That afternoon, Dennis Hale arrived at the hospital to discuss the formal activation of the succession plan. Dad had requested his presence. I was already there. Marcus arrived 18 minutes into the meeting, slightly breathless, having apparently just been called by the hospital receptionist. He walked in, looked at Dennis, looked at me, looked at the documents on the small table, and said, "What's going on?" Dennis said, calmly and without preamble, "We're activating the CEO succession agreement that was ratified by the board 6 weeks ago. Savannah assumes formal leadership of Reese Capital Ventures effective immediately, with Robert's full authorization." The room was very quiet. Marcus looked at Dad. Dad met his eyes steadily, without apology. Then Marcus looked at me, and I watched the full sequence move across his face. Confusion first, then disbelief, then a rapid, visible recalculation as he understood that this was not new information for anyone in the room except him. That this had been in motion for months. That his phone call in the Atlanta hotel hallway had not been a warning delivered to a powerless sister. It had been a boast delivered to the incoming CEO. "You knew," he said. Not a question. A realization arriving late and landing hard. "Yes," I said. When he stopped. Started again. "How long?" "Long enough." He turned back to Dad. "Dad, I don't understand."
"We talked about this."
"You said." "I said I wanted you to understand the operational side," Dad said, his voice quiet but firm. "I said I wanted you to learn from your sister. You heard what you wanted to hear, Marcus. You've been doing that for a long time." The silence that followed that sentence was the longest silence I have ever sat inside. Marcus's jaw tightened. I could see him deciding whether to fight this, calculating whether there was an angle, a lever, something he could use. Then he looked at Dennis, who was watching him with the neutral patience of a man who has seen this exact moment many times in many different rooms. And something went out of Marcus's posture. Not permanently. I knew my brother too well to think this was over, but in that moment, in that room, he understood that there was nothing to reach for. He looked at me one last time, and I said, gently and without triumph, "I'm going to take care of this company, Marcus." That was always the plan. He left without another word. The months that followed were not simple.
"I want to be honest about that."
Marcus contested the succession through the company's internal grievance process, his right, and a process I respected even while being confident in its outcome. The board reviewed everything again. Dennis presented the full documentation trail. The grievance was formally dismissed after 6 weeks. Marcus resigned from his VP position shortly after. He started a small independent client consulting practice, using his relationship skills in a context where he was accountable only to himself, which, honestly, suited him better than he ever admitted. Last I heard, he was doing reasonably well. We do not speak regularly, but we are not enemies. The anger between us has cooled into something more like a careful distance, which is probably the most honest version of our relationship that has ever existed. Dad recovered fully over 4 months. He came back to the office in a consulting capacity, his choice and one I welcomed. Having his institutional knowledge accessible without the dynamic of his authority above mine turned out to be the version of our working relationship that functioned best for both of us. He told me, over coffee one morning in what used to be his office and was now mine, that naming me CEO was the best business decision he had ever made. I told him I wished he had made it sooner. He said he knew. We left it there. Reese Capital Ventures, in my first full year of formal leadership, grew its client portfolio by 18% and was recognized by a regional business publication as one of the top independent advisory firms in the Carolinas. I hired 3 new analysts, promoted 2 people who had been overlooked for years, and rebuilt the client communication process that had cost us that $500,000 account, the one that traced back to Marcus's unfixed gap, the one I had flagged in that memo that sat unread. Chloe, the junior associate who had almost been scapegoated for that failure, is now a senior manager. She is exceptional. I should have protected her more loudly at the time, and that is something I carry. There is a moment I come back to when I think about all of this. Not the board vote, not the hospital room, not the look on Marcus's face when he understood what had happened. It's the moment in the parking garage, 6 years in, when I finally asked myself, what do I actually want? I had spent so long managing around the question, working harder, documenting more, staying later, being undeniable, that I had forgotten to actually want anything for myself. I had been building a case when I should have been building a future. The case was necessary, but the future was the point. If you are somewhere I have been, doing real work inside a structure that refuses to see it, surrounded by assumptions that have calcified into facts, wondering if the answer is just to work harder and wait, I want you to hear this. Documentation matters, preparation matters, patience matters. But none of it matters without the moment when you sit down with a blank page and ask yourself what you actually want, and then have the courage to write the honest answer. That question changed everything for me. Not Marcus's phone call, not the board vote, not the succession documents. The blank page. The honest answer. The decision to stop waiting for someone to hand me something I had already earned. Reese Capital is mine now, not because it was given to me, because I built myself into the only person who could actually lead it. And I do, every single day, with everything I have. That is enough. That has always been enough.